My mother was the president of the Fullerton Federated in California twice, and of the San Clemente Federated twice. My very first speech, political speech, was to the Fullerton Federated before my mother was an officer, so there was no nepotism. I was 18 years old, and I talked to some of the club leadership about the solidarity trade union movement in Poland and how it could end up overthrowing the Iron Curtain. And at the time, I was the president of the College Republican Club, Cal State Fullerton. So I have a long history with the Federation of Republican Women. My wife is a member. I've been an associate member. All of you gentlemen who live here, I hope you're associate members. I don't want to call you out now. Where's your treasurer so they can pay their dues? The treasurer is over here. How much does it cost for a gentleman to be an associate member of your unit?
$15. $15.
$15, gentlemen. You probably spend less than that on the football pool, right? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so tonight we have two presentations tonight. We're going to talk to you a bit about what we at the Foundation, and we're a nonprofit, 501c3. We're a nonpartisan outfit. We are conservative, and we tend to align more with Republicans than with Democrats, but we are nonpartisan. And we're going to talk about two things. First of all, what is coming down the pike in the legislative session, and what are our objectives? What do we want to see passed to make Texas even more free market oriented and more secure in its finances? And then secondly, I wanted to share with you some very groundbreaking research that I'm doing on poverty and big government. And these two things actually go together. When you look at our very first presentation about what we hope to see the legislature do, and you link that to the second presentation on poverty, you're actually going to understand the connection and why it is compassionate to want more free market competition in Texas and more dynamism in the economy, because it actually helps the poor. Okay, so that's what we're going to do tonight. Now, we think that what is upcoming for this new legislative session is going to be both a blessing and a curse. And they're both the same thing. Lots of extra money. We expect to see in excess of $10 billion of additional resources above what was expected that the legislature is going to have to play with. And that's composed of a couple of $1 billion of rollover surplus, $4+ billion of additional sales tax revenue above what was expected, probably even more. Another $4 billion that will probably come through as the result of increased property taxes. So it will actually diminish the amount of money that the state is obligated to pay local school districts under Robin Hood. So that'll basically free up $4 billion. And I haven't even talked about the Economic Stabilization Fund, where the oil and gas excess revenues go, right? So you're going to have a lot of money. And why is that a problem? Because, as we learned from the likes of P.J. O'Rourke, right, that what happens when lawmakers get a lot of money, right? It's like teenage boys with car keys and whiskey. They spend it! They spend all the money, and then what happens when the economy slows down? Then there's pressure to do what? Increase taxes, right? Or cut programs that you all actually support and say, oh, this is awful, we got to cut these really important programs. And of course, they never talk about the programs you'd like to see cut, right? And so we need to hold the line. And so what we would like to see is one of the most important measures that can be undertaken in the upcoming legislative session is to get rid of the margin tax, the business franchise tax. If Texas could do that, we'd be the only state in the union without an individual income tax and no business tax as well. Do you think that that would stimulate the Texas economy? That would be great. The number two thing is to enact a strengthened tax and expenditure limitation, a strengthened TEL. Currently, only a portion of the Texas budget is constrained by a tax and expenditure limitation, and that is linked to a future estimate of personal income growth in the state. The problem with that is the legislative budget board chooses which estimate they want to use. And there's no true-up at the end of the 2 years. So in other words, if personal income comes in less, they don't cut, right? It's not, there's no true-up. And it doesn't apply to all funds. And so additional federal matching funds come in, or what happened in the last legislative session? They spent all the money, a lot of extra money, they spent it all. And they said, oh, but we still need to spend some money on water and on transportation. So let's have the people vote on it. Well, if the people vote on it, does it count toward the limit? No, it doesn't, because you voted on it. It's now off books. And so now you get billions of dollars of additional spending that didn't count toward the limit. You wonder, what are we paying all the money for anyway? I thought it was I thought water and transportation were an integral part of government services. And so what we need to have is a tax and expenditure limitation that applies to everything. So they can't play these tricks of moving the budget around and moving things off book so they can spend more money on things that maybe aren't your priorities. So that's number 2. Number 3, we would like to see something called the Sales Tax Relief Fund enacted, the STAR Fund. Everyone loves acronyms, so it's a little A for the STAR because it's Sales Tax, TA, right? Relief Fund, STAR Fund. And what the STAR Fund would be used for is it's a mechanism to help your fiscally conservative lawmakers to cut the budget. Because something you may not know about the way things work in the Texas budget process is once that legislative budget board determines here's the overall spending we're going to do, it's very tough to cut the budget. Because what happens is if you say, well, let's consolidate these 3 departments over here, let's eliminate this obsolete program, and we'll save, let's say, $350 million. Well, currently, that money has to be spent somewhere, so they just move that $350 million to some other spot in the budget, and they still spend it. So the bottom line stays the same. Well, if you create the STAR Fund, what you can do is you can transfer the money that you save from closing parts of government, from holding the line on spending. You can shift that money into the STAR Fund. And once it goes into the STAR Fund, what do you do with it? I'm glad you asked. What happens is that the comptroller will reduce the sales tax rate for a certain period of time, and what they'll do is they'll draw that money out of the STAR Fund to make the budget whole. And that way, Texans get to see a direct connection between their lawmakers being frugal and them getting a little bit of relief at the cash register. And then it puts a little more pressure, a little more downward pressure on budgetary spending. So, eliminate the margin tax, strengthen tax and expenditure limitation, STAR Fund. 2 more big items. Now, I have our laundry list here. I didn't bring enough for everybody because Lord knows no one, who could have ever imagined how gigantic this unit is? But I'll put a couple on each table and you can pass them down. This is our Lone Star Liberty Action Agenda. And so you'll see a little more detail in here that goes beyond just those few things. And if you're particularly active with your lawmakers, you can use this. And it's online too. You can see it online. So, 2 more things. There is ongoing pressure to expand Medicaid under Obamacare. About half the states have done so. The Texas Hospital Association and certain doctors are trying really hard to expand Medicaid. We look at it this way. Medicaid is a broken program. Why do you want to make a broken program even bigger? So let's not do that, because while the money is free now, it's not always going to be free. And by the way, the health care that you're providing for the poor is not all that good under Medicaid. So let's not expand Medicaid. That's number 4. And the 5th big item, now there are more items in the Liberty Action Agenda. The 5th big item is school choice. Now when you compare Texas schools to our big state peers, and you look at standardized test scores by race and ethnicity, we actually score near the top of the country. If you compare, for example, white non-Hispanic students to white non-Hispanic students, black non-Hispanics to black non-Hispanics, etc. Right? We do pretty well. but we're Texas, we ought to be number one. And the challenge with school choice is quite simple. People who would normally be in favor of it philosophically typically live in the suburban and rural areas. And typically they're happy with their schools. And they're like, why do we need school choice? My schools are great. Well, let me tell you why you need school choice. Because the children that go to the inner city schools are going to failing schools. These children are largely minority children. And if we don't equip these Texans, who will soon be a majority in the state, with the tools to be successful, to grab a piece of the American dream and to live it, who do you think that they're going to think that they need to rely on? They're going to rely on government. So if we don't equip them to go out and start their own businesses, to be their own boss, then we ought not to expect them to be in favor of free markets and smaller government. So think of it this way. Think of it as a matter of enlightened self-interest and preservation of what we hold dear in the Lone Star State. That is one of the reasons why we need school choice. A child that is going to school, a family school in an urban area, ought not to be consigned to a family school just because their parents can't afford to live in a better zip code. That's what this is all about. And so we desperately need to reform education in Texas. And contrary to Judge Dietz down in Austin, it's not just about money. In fact, if you compare Texas to the rest of the country, using statistics from the National Education Association, that august conservative group, you'll see that Texas actually has better than the national average of student-to-teacher ratio. And why is that? It's because as bad as things are, we're less bad than other states. We actually have less administrative overhead, so we can afford more teachers. Imagine that. How many people knew that we had better than the national average of student-to-teacher ratio? Because you don't hear that propaganda much from the left, do you? All you hear is how horrible it is. You also hear how poorly paid our teachers are, right? Well, gee, they're paid at maybe 89% of the national average. And you know the cost of living in Texas is about 92% of the national average? So if you're paid at 89 and the cost of living is 92, that's kind of average, isn't it? So yeah, they're paid a little less here, but so is everybody else because we have a low cost of living in Texas because we have less government, less regulation, which is why we have a low cost of living. So those are our 5 big agenda items. The Lone Star Liberty Action Agenda has some other things. I've also got a few more things that I can hand out. A conservative Texas budget, which is kind of something only an accountant could love. It's like a rundown of accounting for the dollars and cents in the conservative Texas budget. In other words, where does the money really go? I'm free to discuss that later as far as Q&A. Now, the other part of our agenda. We've been teasing you by dimming lights, and I know some of you in the back are falling asleep. And if I do hear any snoring, this cord is long enough. I can come out into the audience and I can whack you atop the head with the microphone. And not only will you wake up, it will make a noise and everyone will hear it and know that you were falling asleep and I had to wake you up. So don't do that. All right, so government spending. Does more help the poor? Does more help the economy? And then kind of an interesting example of comparing the 2 biggest states, one to the other. Because I do know a few things about California, having served in that godforsaken dysfunctional legislature for 6 years of my life. And I don't know how in the heck I can get that back. It's like as soon as I figured out about Texas, I came here as quickly as I could. So here I am, whether you like it or not, right? So, thank God for Texas. All right, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so how many people remember Obama talking to Joe the plumber? Back a slide. You're going too fast. Okay. When you spread the wealth around, it's good for everybody. Remember that? All right. Government programs are needed to help the poor. This is what the liberals think, that more government programs are better. Now, how many of you have heard of a guy named Frederick Bastiat? Right? What is seen and what is unseen. He was the economist that talked about the shop owner whose window was broken. and then he has to go pay the glazier to fix his window. And how some people would say, well, this stimulates the economy, right? The glazier now has a job. And what Bastiat said was, no, this is a fallacy, because that's what you see. But what you don't see is if the window was never broken, the baker could have upgraded his shop. He could have paid for maybe another employee. He could have opened a new location. That's what is unseen. And you see the left, because they love government programs, they are enamored with what you can see. So in the case of welfare, for example, you're giving somebody something, you see that. What you don't see are the unintended consequences of giving someone else's money to somebody for not working. You don't see that. And so you have to remember Bastiat. Next slide. All right, this is a terrifying slide here. I've got a blue line and a red line. Anytime you see a blue line and a red line, it's always going to be terrifying. Okay, so the blue line is the aggregate of federal money that's gone to the state and local governments. Okay, that's what the blue line is. You see how close it is to the red line? What is the red line? It is the cumulative federal debt. And what you can see by that chart is a gigantic portion of our federal debt is comprised of money, borrowed money, that the federal government has sent down to the states in the form of grants. For example, Medicaid. Now, what happens when the federal government sends money down to the states or to a city? Does that money come down without any strings attached? No. Is that money really free? Or does that money have chains on it? That money has chains on it. What's happening is that the federal bureaucracy, the federal elected officials who represent the interests of the large, uncompetitive states like New York and California, are putting rules on the money to make Texas more like California and New York, so that your competitiveness goes down relative to their competitiveness. You see how that works? And it's done with borrowed money that your grandkids have to pay back. So that's why blue lines and red lines on a chart are always terrifying. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about the poverty measure, the official poverty measure in the United States. I'm hazarding to guess that everything that you know about poverty is wrong. Everything that you think you know about poverty in this audience is wrong. And I'm hazarding that guess because I didn't know this stuff about poverty when I started researching it. How many of you have heard about something called the federal poverty line? Okay, how about the official poverty measure? Okay, you hear typically folks on the left talk about, oh, there's all these children in Texas and all these people who are below poverty. Well, what does that mean? Well, there was a study in 1955 that decided that, well, let's measure poverty as being 3 times a subsistence diet budget. Okay? 3 times a subsistence diet budget. Now, here's the problem with that. Has food as a portion of our income remained the same in the last 50 years? No, it hasn't. And in a nod to people who are on the liberal side, we spend less on food today than we did 50 years ago because farmers are more efficient, we have a more prosperous society, we have more free trade, and we have better transportation. So in spite of things like ethanol, which have raised the price of corn and feedstock, food is a smaller portion of our budget today than it was 50 years ago. So when you triple something that's a smaller portion, then you're probably understating poverty using that measure relative to 50 years ago. That's number one. Number two, this is a stunner to me. The federal government poverty level doesn't take into account regional cost of living differences. Now, let me ask you, do you think that the cost of living in Denton is the same as the cost of living in Brooklyn, New York? Think there might be a bit of a difference between those two locations in goods and services and housing costs? Yes, probably about 45%, maybe 50%. But the federal government doesn't take that into account with the federal poverty level. It's the same in every state. That to me is stunning. Well, how did that initially the poverty level was just an academic experiment, and it got adapted into federal law with the Great Society in the early 60s. And once it gets adapted into federal law, what happens? Well, handouts then are based on the federal poverty level. And that means if you change it, guess what? There's going to be winners and losers. So that's why you can never change it. And so it never gets talked about. The other thing that happens with the federal poverty level is they never break out, nor do they ever discuss the racial or ethnic breakdown in every state. They just say the poverty level in Texas is X, the poverty level in Wisconsin or Massachusetts is Y. And because Texas is a low cost of living state, and because Texas has a lot of racial and ethnic minorities, we always have high poverty by those standards. But what if you were to break out the data and compare like groups to like groups? And what if you were to adjust for the cost of living? What would poverty look like then, you ask? Right? Well, I'm glad you asked. So here's a heat map of the official poverty measure in the United States. And as you would expect, the South looks worse than the other parts of the country. But the South also happens to be the place with a lower cost of living. And the South also happens to be a place with more racial and ethnic minorities than the rest of the country. Next slide. So here we have a map showing the supplemental poverty measure. Now what this is, it's a new poverty measure. It's done by the U.S. Census Bureau, but it's not used for anything official. It's only been around for 3 years. And I've talked to the PhD economists who developed this, the census. And what they're doing with this is they're taking into account the cost of housing, and only the cost of housing, and by the way, they're understating that. They're taking into account non-cash benefits like food stamps and Section 8 housing. They're taking into account taxes. So it's a more comprehensive measure than is the traditional poverty measure. So as you look at that, see how California all of a sudden looks worse than it did before? New York looks worse because they're taking into account the cost of housing. Next slide. Here's the problem with that though. If you look at the states that are crosshatched, those are the 21 states that have the highest percentage of white non-Hispanics in the state. And so if you don't take into account race and ethnicity when you're studying poverty, all you're doing is simply plotting where the white people live. And that isn't very useful for public policy purposes, right? Because, it's like, oh, gee, look, Wisconsin has low poverty. Wisconsin is virtually monochromatic. Right? How can you learn anything from that? You can't. You have to look at racial and ethnic groups because there are vast poverty differences across America based on race and ethnicity. And you have to adjust for cost of living. Next slide. So, if you adjust for cost of living, and if you look at racial and ethnic groups individually, you start to see some patterns. So I looked at the 12 biggest states where about 60% of Americans live. Because the 12 biggest states, from California at the top to Virginia at the bottom, have diverse economies, they have large, diverse populations, and you can learn something by comparing the poverty rates across them. And so I've been running some pretty intensive statistical analyses of these 12 big states across 15 different demographic variables, looking at over 50, that's 50, economic and public policy measurements, looking for patterns. And I'm going to share with you a couple of the patterns that we've discovered in a report that's soon to be published about poverty. As we do, though, check this out. Virginia and Texas have the most conservative governments among the 12, meaning the proportion of taxes and spending and regulation that they have as states. Probably not a surprise to anybody. The states that are at the other end of the spectrum are California and New York. Again, I'm sure not a shock to anybody in this audience. So let's check out and see how poor people do in those 4 representative states out of the Big 12, because these are the 2 states at the opposite ends, the 2 most conservative and the 2 most liberal. So back up one. So what we see is that white poverty is 3rd lowest in Virginia, 4th lowest in Texas. It's the worst in California, and the 4th worst in New York. We see that black poverty is the lowest in Texas out of the 12 states, 3rd lowest in Virginia, 2nd worst in California, and fifth worst in New York. We see that Hispanic poverty, specifically Mexican national origin, and I narrowed it down to Mexican national origin because they're the largest group of Hispanics in America, number one. And number two, just like with Asians, there are vast poverty differences among Hispanics depending on their national origin, with Cubans having the least poverty and Dominicans and Puerto Ricans having the most poverty. Right? So I wanted to just compare the same group, because if you go to Florida or New Jersey or New York, there are a lot of Hispanics there that aren't from Mexico, that don't trace their heritage to Mexico. And so Hispanic poverty is the lowest in Virginia, third lowest in Texas. It's the second worst in New York and third worst in California. You see how consistent those patterns are? Isn't that interesting? Something you'd never hear a liberal ever admit, that when you adjust for cost of living, racial minorities do really well in Texas relative to our peer big state competitors. Now, how could that be? I thought we were supposed to be a terrible place for poor people, right? Because we don't tax people enough. You need to pay more of your money and spread that wealth around. Go to the next slide. So, this is a very fascinating slide. So what I've done here is I've plotted the incidence of marriage, because marriage is closely associated with poverty. So I've looked at the incidence of marriage among black non-Hispanic individuals aged 24 to 64, this is all U.S. Census data, by the way, against the official poverty measure as adjusted for the cost of living index. You've got to adjust for cost of living. Look at how tight that ratio, or how tight those relationships are to the line. And you see an R squared up there of almost 59, which means that 59% of those two things that we're measuring can explain one to the other. So what you see there is Virginia has the highest marriage rate among African Americans, and it also has the lowest poverty rate. And you see that Texas has the second highest marriage rate and the second best poverty rate, second lowest poverty rate. Isn't that interesting? And at the bottom, you see New York and Ohio and California, where African Americans have a low marriage rate and a high poverty rate. See how those are linked? Now, what is the most basic element of government among mankind? I heard someone say family, right? Am I putting you to sleep? I only heard like one person say family. Family, right? Family is the most basic unit of government. Doesn't it stand to reason then that nature abhors a vacuum? And that if government is big and powerful and robust and taking all kinds of resources, that maybe families suffer and there's less marriage and less kids born within wedlock? Maybe. Well, let's look at the next slide. This slide shows the amount of married African Americans in the 12 biggest states as plotted over the Fraser Institute's Freedom Index. Fraser Institute is a think tank out of Canada, and they plot the relative amount of freedom in all of the 50 states and provinces, the Canadian provinces. And so what you're seeing here is that the states that have the most freedom, Virginia and Texas, also have the most marriage among African Americans. And what you see there is an R squared of 77, meaning that that is a tight relationship, where the more government you have, the less marriage you have. Now what I found is that's true among all three of the ethnic groups I studied, but it's the most true for African Americans. It's the most true for African Americans. They appear to be the most adversely affected by big government. Next slide. Now, let's look at the two biggest states. You learn a lot from comparing the two biggest states where 1/5 of Americans live. 1/5 of Americans, 20%, are either Californians or Texans, or Californians who want to be Texans. And so, you look at the demographic breakdown of the two states, they're remarkably similar. And that's why they're so interesting to study, because of how similar they are demographically, and yet the results couldn't be more different. Next slide. California, at the state and local level, taxes 42% more of its income than does Texas. Can you imagine paying 42% more taxes? Just imagine it. Be with me for a second. Imagine it. Now listen to those fireworks. That's the sound of Disneyland in the distance because you now live in California. If you can imagine paying 42% more taxes. There's 44% more state and local spending in California than in Texas as a portion of the economy. And if you look at poverty, based on that new supplemental poverty measure that at least takes into account the cost of housing, California has proportionately 45% more people in poverty than does Texas. Now, that's not an absolute number. I know California has a lot more people. I'm talking proportionately. 23.8% of Californians are in poverty, the highest poverty rate in the nation, according to this new, more comprehensive U.S. Census Bureau measure of poverty. And yet we know from demographics that we have the same percentage of Hispanics in each state, California and Texas. And Texas has about double the number of African Americans as does California. And yet, they have 3 people in poverty for every 2 here. That's a pretty big difference. And yet we are told by the media, we are told by the academic thinkers that California is the paradigm future model for America, and that's the template that the president is basing his policies on, right? That's the future. And if that's the future, let me off the train. Because I think that Texas is the once in the future America. That Texas is the blueprint. So, what about on the Texas side of the ledger? Well, since the end of the recession, Texas has generated jobs at a rate 63% higher than has California as a share of the job force. And if you account for the cost of living using the federal statistics, which again, they understate the differences between the states. The federal statistics understate the difference, but even with these understated differences, the real per capita income in Texas is 7% higher than in California because things are cheaper here. So your dollar goes further here. Isn't that interesting? You would think that with Silicon Valley and Hollywood that California would be doing better, but the reason why they're not, they got all those poor people. Next slide. And that is it. So you can bring the lights back up. And I can answer some questions for you because you may have a few now that I've stimulated your craniums, I hope. I do have a paper, by the way, called Texas versus California Myth-Busting Time. Pass a few of these out as well. You can use them to annoy any liberal friends you might have, assuming that you actually have a liberal friend. I know I don't have very many at all. And that paper is on the website as well. So, questions? The gentleman, by the way, fair warning to the gentleman. If a gentleman asks me a question, I'm going to ask him a question. And the question is going to be, are you an associate member of this unit? So, if you're not an associate member of the unit and you're a gentleman, your question to me will cost you $15. Do you still wish to ask the question, sir? Okay. Are you an associate member of this unit? Okay, very good. Yes, sir. Please, ask 2 questions.
My question is,
I'll repeat the question to you, by the way.
somebody comes up and speaks all the statistics. The thing I find most in discourse between the 2 sides of the debate is somebody says, here's my statistics, and somebody else says, here's my statistics. So, one question is, where do the conservatives come in to try and have the discourse on, I have a census supplemental factor here, page 39, here's my footnotes, so on and so forth. Where does that come into the debate? Bring the show the great factors to solidify the point where here's my census.
Right. Well, the question is basically you have competing statistics out there, and you know how do you move the policy agenda forward where you have these competing statistics? Well, first of all, I can tell you that the data that we've developed on this poverty is groundbreaking. Nobody's done this before. And nobody's done this before because, largely speaking, conservatives don't engage very much on the issue of poverty, and the liberals don't want to look at the breakdowns like I've done, because that, I think it probably scares them, because it kind of shreds a few of their well-constructed, myths about poverty, about it being a phenomenon of the South, and in fact it's not, right? It also forces them to confront the fact that big government increases costs. When you have restrictive housing laws, excessive zoning, environmental regulations, developer fees, all of these things that prevent the housing market from meeting demand, they drive up the cost of houses. And so what we're doing with these statistics is our audience at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is primarily the legislature, right? So we're focusing on policymakers who, because they self-selected to run for office, they tend to be more interested in this sort of thing than the average person who has to earn a living and doesn't necessarily have the time. And so what we're hoping to do with this information and the report that will be issued in a few weeks is spark an interest in welfare reform 2.0. Because it's been since 1996 that welfare reform has passed on a federal level, and a lot of the gains have been lost since then. A lot of the reforms have been eroded, and certainly very rapidly eroded under this president. And so we think that welfare reform effort that was largely led by Newt Gingrich and the new Republican Congress back in the mid-90s, we think that served to reduce poverty, and that there were a lot of good things about that, but we need to re-engage and try that again. Because what we're seeing with these numbers is categorical proof that there are less poor people in states that have a lighter hand of government. Now, you could argue cause and effect, and correlation doesn't equal causation and all that, but at some point you got to engage common sense, and you got to think, okay, do you get more of what you subsidize? Yeah, pretty much you always get more of what you subsidize. And if you subsidize idleness, right, if you don't subsidize and encourage people to work, are they going to go work? No. Right? And that's the challenge that we got to look at. Yes?
This is the fact that so many people are voting with their feet, coming from California to Texas, kind of trump the statistics that they have for the other side.
You would think that all the people moving here would, but Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who writes for the New York Times, has said for years that the only reason why people are moving to Texas is because we have a sunny climate, right? Now I don't know about Mr. Krugman, but I used to represent Newport Beach and Laguna Beach, right? I live 8 miles from the Pacific coast, okay? The average temperature where I lived was probably like 68 degrees, average. And so I can attest to you that last winter in Dripping Springs it was 13 degrees for a few days. And I can attest to you that it's been over 100 quite frequently this summer, and that it's a lot more humid than where I used to live. So I don't think I moved here for the weather, right? And so just last week, Paul Krugman had an article where he finally admitted that maybe one of the reasons why people are moving to Texas and other southern states is because there's cheaper housing here. So he finally admitted that maybe it has something to do with housing costs. Now we have to get him to admit that the reason why housing is cheaper here is because there's not so many darn rules to make it expensive. Right? That's part of the challenge. And by the way, I want to put your mind a little bit at ease about the horde of people coming here from other places. First of all, the Texas Tribune did a poll with UT about the political attitude of Californians moving to Texas, and they found that, as I recall, 57% of Californians moving to Texas describe themselves as conservative versus 27% liberal. So more than 2 to 1. Conservative to liberal. Number two, if you're a liberal, a true liberal, the last place in the world you want to move is Texas. Okay? It's a god-awful red state. They love guns. It's part of the so if you believe all the liberal propaganda about Texas, the last place you're going to want to move voluntarily is Texas. So it's a self-selecting process, right? I sought out the Lone Star State. Now, I had a great-grandfather that was born here, just north of here. I think Denison, is Denison up near the border with Oklahoma? So I have some tenuous roots to Texas that I'm going to claim because I did have a kid that was born here. But generally, you're going to find that people moving here are conservative-minded and want to work. Yes, sir. Sir, are you an associate member of this unit? Yes. Okay, another associate member. Yes, I will answer your question, sir. Yes. Yes, there is some data on it. The question is, if racial minorities are doing better here economically than in California, what's the data on how they vote? I do know that there is some data on Hispanic voters here in Texas. That as a general rule, data has shown that Texas Hispanic voters vote 6 to 10% more conservative than the national average here in Texas. So I think what you're seeing is a few things. Number one, there's a longer history of heritage with Hispanics in Texas than there is with California. Hispanic immigration in California is a more recent phenomenon. Number two, I found data that was very fascinating. When I moved here, I looked around and I'm thinking, Hispanics in Texas look different. They just look different. What's going on? Yeah, I'm an intelligence officer in the Army, and that's, I observe, I look around. And so I looked for a year to find data, and I finally found data that tracked 10 months worth of matricular consular card applications at Mexican consulates in America, and they tracked what state in Mexico to what state in America these individuals moved. And these, of course, were mainly illegal immigrants. And what I found was that overwhelmingly, by almost 2 to 1, the people moving to California were from the more southern, more indigenous states where you had more subsistence agriculture. And I found that more of the people moving to Texas were from the northern states where there's more industry and the people are less Indian and more Spanish. And so, people forget that Mexico is a very diverse country. It's not homogenous, right? Just like America, it's not homogenous. And so because of long-standing patterns of trade and connections of families, the immigration patterns are different across America. California also has a lot more folks that move to there from Central America versus virtually none up to recently in Texas. So there's a different type of immigration occurring. And that may explain some of it too. I'm not sure. I leave that to other experts to figure out. Way in the back. Why is it just a bunch of guys asking questions? You must have a lot of associates. Okay, yes, please.
Okay, this information is wonderful. I want to go back to number 2, where you talk about the limitation, the restraint on the spending, the budget, what Texas Public Policy recommends, and then if you could relate that to the last session. I think they added like $24 billion.
So you're talking about the tax expenditure limitation. So to go a little deeper on that, what we recommend is that you have a backward-looking limit based on population plus inflation for the prior 2 years. So it's not a forward-looking estimate. It's a look backward and says, okay, Texas grew by a certain percent, and we know inflation was a certain percent, and so we're going to cap the next biennium spending based on that growth from the previous 2 years. So it takes the guesswork out of it. That's number one. Number two, the limit applies to both general funds and all funds. So we're applying the limit to just Texas money, and we're applying the limit to Texas money plus federal money. And you got to stay under the limit for both of those. Now, the challenge with last year was the following. You had, because of the economy, a big drop-off in revenue in 2011. And a prudent estimate from the comptroller that was later proven to be too conservative and said we're going to get less money because the economy looks slow. And so what the lawmakers did was they didn't fund about 4 months worth of Medicaid expenditures, and they delayed some school payments. So they left part of the budget essentially unwritten, right? They basically left a hole in the budget. But they told all of you, we've cut the budget. And of course the left was all too happy to say, oh, you cut school spending by $5 billion. Oh, you cut this, because the left, of course, wants to spend more money. And so it was almost like a game where both sides were kind of in on it because the leadership wanted you all to think that they were responsible and cut, and the left wanted you all to think that the sky was falling and that there's these huge cutbacks. And so what they did when they came back in the news session was they said, okay, we got to backfill, we got to actually pay for those months that we didn't fund. And then if you carry that forward to the news session, you basically double it because you didn't fund it and now you got to fund it in the news session. So you double it. And if you do that exercise, it's about $8 billion and $8 billion. Right? So out of the close to $20 billion of additional revenue, about $16 billion was accounted for from these accounting tricks. And what we were trying to say as a foundation was, look guys, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't tell the people you really cut the budget when all you did was kick the can, right? You can't really claim you cut the budget. And you did have a lot more money to spend, so let's prioritize your spending to the things that are really important. Once you take care of education, once you take care of Medicaid, then what about roads and water? But instead, they save roads and water until the end in a special session after they spend all the money. And here's the secret. The state of Texas is only a couple $100 million away from its legal statutory spending limit. And Medicaid, because of all the talk about Obamacare, is about $1 billion underfunded. Some of that's federal money, but when you add up the state money, it pushes us up to or over the statutory limit. And so what that means is that your lawmakers, when they come back next session, are probably going to be faced with a vote to bust the budget for the current budget we're in today. And as I understand, I think that's a 60% threshold budget. And I can imagine the Democrats playing games with that, even though they want to spend the money. They'll say, oh, we're not going to vote for it. And they're going to force all the conservatives to vote for that budget, because if they don't, oh, you're in default, or you're running away from the obligations of the state of Texas. But that's how much money they spent. They're probably going to vote to bust the budget for the current budget cycle that we're in. And when they do that, by the way, it adds to the base of the next budget. See, when you put more spending in the current budget year, you simply add on the personal income estimate onto what you actually spent. And so anything you add in the current budget adds more spending for the next budget, which makes it easier to spend all the money. Question over here? How am I doing on time? I'm a little over. Well, I have a lot of driving to do. Madam President, what's your pleasure? All right.
So, one thing that I've heard about Texas and repeats in interviews is that they go after him and they say, Texas has the most uninsured people in the country.
Right.
And he doesn't know what to say.
Okay. Right.
Is that true?
Yeah. So here's when the left attacks Texas and say Texas has the most uninsured people in the country, the first thing I got to ask people is, okay, so does having a piece of paper that says Medicaid equate to actual quality medical care? Okay, so coverage doesn't equal care, right? Just because you're covered doesn't mean you're actually going to get care. By the way, how many doctors in California under Medi-Cal, which is California's version of Medicaid, how many doctors in California are actually seeing new patients? Less than half. Okay? Because they have the lowest reimbursement rates in the country. Because they're like, doctors make all kinds of money, they can afford it, we'll just stretch out the payments so that we can cover more people. So, here's the challenge with the people who are not insured in Texas. Number one, we have a great dynamic economy. It's the envy of the nation. Immigrants, whether illegal or legal, go where the jobs are. Most people who come here don't come here for the welfare, especially in Texas. They come here to work. And so immigrants are very mobile, and they go to where the work is. can an immigrant legally get Medicaid or get insurance under Obamacare? No. Can an illegal immigrant specifically? No, they can't. And so if Texas has a large number of illegal immigrants, and we do, they can't get coverage anyway, unless they get coverage on the private marketplace through their employer, which not a lot of them are going to, but some may. Number two, there are, as I recall, I may be off on my numbers, about 1/3 of Texas's uninsured are people who make more than $50,000 a year, as I recall. I may be wrong on my number, but it's people who make enough money that they can afford it and they choose not to buy insurance. Last time I looked, it's still a free country. And if you think you're a bulletproof 25-year-old male who isn't likely going to get pregnant, why do you need insurance coverage? Right? It's a waste of money if you're bulletproof at 25. So, and some people pay out of pocket. And some of that just varies from region to region. You have different regions with different traditions. We have a low rate of unionization in Texas. And a lot of unions, like up in Massachusetts, their negotiations kind of come with a health care plan. So the question has to be asked, instead of what is the coverage, you have to ask, how is medical care in Texas? Are people dying in the streets? Are they being taken care of? And if you look at things like death rates, if you look at things like the number of people who have jobs and are caring for their families, there are other measures of well-being that we excel in. And having coverage, if what you really mean by that is you've signed people up for Medicaid, I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. In fact, there have been studies that have shown that the healthcare outcomes under Medicaid are actually worse than not even having insurance, which I'm sure is not a complete shock to some of you who understand that Medicaid is brought to you by the same people that brought you the U.S. Postal Service. So we have time for one more question. So as far as the people who come here recently, if you look at the total numbers of people and how large the state is and where these people are being farmed out to, I don't think a large percentage of them will necessarily remain in Texas. As far as the young men who have come here, they have come here to work. Just because you're 16 or 17 doesn't mean you're here to get welfare. They're going to be working somewhere. Because that's what they know to do, right? That's how they survive where they came from. They don't have welfare where they came from. The thing that concerns me the most is what happens with the poor and the immigrants to America when they encounter our welfare system. That's what worries me the most. What do we do to their work ethic? And something that might shock some of you is that if you look at the TANF program, that's the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, used to be known as AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, right? It's now called TANF. If you look at the TANF numbers, across America, California has 1 in 8 people who live in California, about 12.5% of the population. California has 33% of all the TANF recipients in the country. And that's traditional welfare. So they have 1 in 8 people who live there, but 1 in 3 TANF recipients for the entire country are in California. An adult, not a child, but an adult in Texas is about 19 times less likely to be on TANF than in California. That's what I call the Lone Star work ethic, right? We don't subsidize as much welfare as does the Golden State. And so what do you get when you subsidize something? You get more of it, right? All right, so I think that the key is that we have to maintain a dynamic economy. We have to reinforce what we do well. That's why we want to get rid of the business margin tax. Because we believe that hard work and entrepreneurship is going to lift everybody's boat. Immigrant and native born, minorities, everybody is going to benefit from that. The statistics from our new study seem to indicate a high degree of connection between poverty and big government. I even found a high degree of connection between a unionized government workforce and black poverty. The more the government workforce is unionized, the higher the black and Hispanic poverty rates. By the way, white poverty rates weren't all that effective because government union workers are generally white. So isn't that an interesting thing when you look at that implication of what the left always tells us? So that's some of the fun things that we're working on at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're on our 25th year in Texas. We got about 40 employees. We're building a great new headquarters across the street of our current office, 2 blocks away from the Capitol. And lastly, if anyone's interested, I brought a bunch of copies of my book, The Texas Model, Prosperity in the Lone Star State and Lessons for America. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a love poem to Texas from a California refugee. Selling it for $10 and you'll get my signature at no added